Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and we're going to talk today about women's health and well-being. And the focus of our conversation for this lesson is going to be Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century monastic figure who was very popular and remains very popular to this day, actually. So I want to back up a little bit and discuss with you some of the history that Gary Ferngren references in the secondary source reading for this class. He gives you quite a bit of historical context of the Roman Empire at or during the medieval centuries, and so I want to explain a little bit of that for you in case that is troubling or confusing. So when Christianity begins, it's within the context of the Roman Empire, which in the 1st and 2nd century looked something like this. The Burgundy territory here was the territory, roughly, of the Roman Empire. But that's going to change. As Ferngren noted correctly, there were a variety of movements of Germanic people into the western half of the Roman Empire, and this created a lot of challenges for the Roman Empire. It's not accurate to say that the empire fell, even though that is constantly the language that is used. I think it's more accurate to say that the empire transformed, because in many ways the empire doesn't disappear, it doesn't go away, but it is radically transformed by the incursions into the western half of the Roman Empire by groups such as, here up in the north, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes that head over to modern-day England. Groups like the Franks that come in and settle in modern-day Germany and France, and other groups, the Goths and the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, these different groups that move around the Roman Empire in many ways simply looking for territory, looking for a place to settle. But the disruption to society radically changes the western part of the Roman Empire for forever. The eastern part of the empire is largely untouched by the movement of Germanic people, but the Eastern Roman Empire will contend with its own challenges. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire looks like this, and the Roman Empire as a whole has shrunk considerably. From this point on, the territory up in here is going to develop into Gothic kingdoms, Gothic territories. You can see the Saxons, the Frisians, the Franks, the Visigoths. And in time, Europe is also going to be impacted by the movement of additional northern people, coming from territories known as Norway and Sweden and Scandinavia. And Viking incursions will result also in a disruption of territory around the Mediterranean. In time, though, much of this territory is going to settle, and by the time we get to the 11th century, our era of Hildegard, the Roman Empire looks like this. So the Western Roman Empire is largely this territory here, not Norway and Sweden actually, but this area here. The Eastern Roman Empire is this territory here. And the Fatimid Caliphate has emerged with the rise of Islam in the 7th century in Arabia here, and with the movement of Arabs out of Arabia into this area here, the Roman Empire across North Africa and Egypt will shrink and eventually be gone. So the movement of the Arabs across, where'd my cursor go? Across Egypt and North Africa and then up into Spain will impact the development of Christianity and Christianity's relationship in the West, in the East, and also with Islam here in the South. So you can see clearly that this is a time of rather dynamic, rapid change. You have a lot of things happening in terms of urban development and the rise of economy in Western Europe. By the time you get to the 11th century, the age of Hildegard, you have a largely stabilized intellectual life, and you have the beginning of, or the advent of the university system. But remember, the university system only privileges in time certain people. As well, with the rise of the university system, you have the fact that professional religious people, monastic medical professionals, have to begin to defend the right to practice medicine, as we saw in our reading for yesterday. And the fact that you have individuals defending the right to practice medicine proves really the compatibility of religion and science. So medicine as a discipline in the university, something that is distinct from the healing components of religion, is that's something that's starting to take place at this time. There are also some significant tensions that are rising and are important to note at this time in the history of the Roman Empire, and that is there are increasing tensions between Eastern Christians over here in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, okay, and those Christians are known as Eastern Orthodox Christians, and so there are tensions between Eastern Orthodox Christians and what are known as Catholic Christians in the West. Now, these are not two different churches. They really aren't two types of Christians or Christianity, but there are some pretty significant cultural distinctions between the Latin-speaking Christians in the West and the largely Greek-speaking, or in the North, Russian-speaking Christians. And then another important tension to note at this time is the rising Crusade fanaticism. So you'll notice here that once Arabs move out of Arabia here and colonize this territory across Egypt and North Africa and then into Spain, you'll notice that this territory here, where Jerusalem is from this point on, under the control of the caliphates. Now, for Eastern Christians, this is not a problem. And for, in all honesty, most of Western Christendom, this is not a problem. Why? Jerusalem is a pilgrimage site. It's a holy site for Christians. And so for those in control of Jerusalem, for the Arab leaders in control of Jerusalem, they are perfectly happy for Christians to continue to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is also a city of religious significance for Islam, and so it's a site of compatibility, and economically it's beneficial for Christians and Muslims to have good relations. But in time, with the incursion of the Seljuk Turks into this territory here, which is modern-day Turkey, leaders in the West are concerned with the loss of territory, and so crusade events start taking place with troops of a combination of knights and peasants making their way in poorly organized communities across Europe over basically to their death in the territories here. And we'll talk more about that in our next lesson. So this is the world in which Hildegard lives. Now here's Bingen up here. And so let's keep this social context in mind as we explore her texts. So Hildegard of Bingen lived from 1098 to 1179, born in the 11th century, died in the 12th. And she lived a cloistered life, a sequestered life, in an age of accelerating change, which I have just described for you and which you can read in your Ferngren text. This is the general timeline of some of the significant events in her life. Born in 1098, she was dedicated by her family to a monastery at Diesen-Dodenburg at the age of 8. And then by the time she was a young adult, she had been made an abbess in the year 1123. In the year 1167, she did the absolute unthinkable, and she established her own monastery. And I call this unthinkable because as a Benedictine nun, she was under the control of the monastery to which she was attached. And so the fact that she lifted a group of nuns and took them away from a monastery to establish their own monastery was pretty darn significant. She died in 1179. She lived a good long life, good long healthy life. But her legacy lives on in very significant ways. This is an image of the ruins, the remains of Diesen-Dodenburg, the monastery to which she was pledged as a young girl. The monastery that she later built in Bingen is still thriving and alive and well to this day, and a pilgrimage site for people all over the world. So the context of Hildegard, as I mentioned, is that she is a Benedictine nun. And remember, having read in the portion of the Rule of Benedict, care of the sick must rank above and before all else. And so for a cloistered nun in a convent, naturally, as we know, every monastery has its own hospital, and so Hildegard was one of the physicians in charge of the health care of the individuals at the convent. And she was alive during what we consider the final phase of monastic medical education during the advent of the university system. As mentioned, at this point in Europe, as I said, the intellectual life is beginning to be stabilized. And remember, prior to the rise of the university system, education is taking place within the monastery. And so Hildegard is alive and well and learning during this final phase of the monastic medical education system. And we see a shift during her lifetime where the texts are moving from simply the compilation or observation of certain kinds of diseases or treatments and whatnot to interpretation. So we find in these texts that the authors are seeking to discern and analyze and evaluate some deeper truths about the human body and health. And in the process of this interpretation, what's really fascinating is that they draw from a variety of disciplines. And this is true with Hildegard as well. They will draw from the disciplines of theology, of magic, and astrology, to name just a few. And so I actually encourage you to look for those in the short reading that I have for you from Hildegard. How does she combine a variety of disciplines in her explanation for how the body works and how to treat the body?